This is how Hitler's spies were executed by firing squad. It is essential to study how the intelligence services and the training of Hitler youths operated to indoctrinate young and German soldiers in order to understand how they could give their lives to defend such principles even while being mistaken. This happened to the majority of the children and young people trained by the Nazis, who even accused their parents of being traitors. In mid-July of 1941, a non-commissioned officer of the Wehrmacht was writing to his home from the Eastern Front. "The German people owe much to their Führer, for if these beasts, who are our enemies here, were to reach Germany, the murders that would have taken place would not have been seen in the world before. What we have seen could not be described by any newspaper. This borders on the unbelievable. Even the Middle Ages cannot compare with what has happened here. And when someone reads the Stürmer and looks at the photos, this is only a pale illustration of what we see and the crimes committed here by the Jews. Believe me, even the reports in the most sensationalist newspaper are only a fraction of what is happening here." The striking inversion of reality, which attributed the unheard-of brutality of the Wehrmacht and the SS to their own victims, was the most characteristic aspect of the German soldier in adapting to and accepting his actions in the Soviet Union. Welcome to Frontline War Memoirs. Indeed, we can say that it was probably the most effective means of overcoming the moral scruples that many of the soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht might have retained, despite the long years of ideological training. This is what happened to many young people indoctrinated by the Nazis, among them Heinz Petri, a young German spy, who became one of the most emblematic after his execution by a United States firing squad was filmed once he was captured. This young man is precisely a representative of this distorted perception of reality, which gives us a measure of the success of Nazi propaganda and indoctrination. The German soldier was not expected to become ideologically committed to any form of National Socialist theory or dogma. Although the regime wanted soldiers to accept its Weltanschauung, this was never meant to be a solid and coherent set of ideas, but rather a series of slogans derived from its actions and the guidance of these. The central themes of Nazi ideology, racism, anti-Semitism, and the construction of a Lebensraum in the East, as well as a harmonious and racially pure Volksgemeinschaft in the homeland, governed in accordance with the Führerprinzip, had a great affinity with the ways of thinking, organizational principles, self-imposed tasks, and ideals of the army. Nazism and the military tended to idealize battle as the supreme test of the individual and to consider the camaraderie of all soldiers, the so-called Kampfgemeinschaft, as the perfect model of social organization. It was no coincidence, since many of the Nazi ideas had originated in the military sphere, so to an increasing number of officers it seemed natural without further ado to reintroduce them into the army in their most radical form, Nazified. The National Socialists' tendency to emphasize action rather than theory corresponded very well to the military mentality. The act came before thought, which it constantly confirmed and shaped. However, it was not a pragmatic point of view, since underlying the action were a few essential and immovable beliefs and dogmas that no empirical evidence could refute, particularly if they were not based on rational analysis or logical construction, but on faith. Thus, in order not to be hindered by disturbing manifestations of reality or by previously acquired moral codes and traditions, we must constantly observe the world, and especially the causes and consequences of particular actions upon it, through the Nazi ideological filters. This tended to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, whereby by acting in a manner perceived as necessary for the situation, one actually expected to create it, confirming one's own expectations and justifying one's own actions. The confusion between cause and effect was indeed inherent in the war in the East and constituted a vital component of its destructive energy. This deeply rooted itself in the German collective memory of the war. The distorted characteristics of the tortured and massacred served as proof of themselves instead of proof of the inhumanity of their acts. The majority of the men who served as combat troops in the Wehrmacht during the Second World War were children or adolescents, like Heinz Petri when Hitler came to power in 1933. A soldier who was 18 years old in 1943 was only 8 when the Nazis had taken power. Thus, the spearhead of the Third Reich was composed of men who had spent their formative years of youth under National Socialism. This had special importance because the first and main concern of the regime was the indoctrination of the young German generation in the official educational system, and especially within the ranks of the Hitler Youth, HJ, and the Arbeitsdienst or labor service. Exposed to the influence of these new and attractive institutions at a very impressionable age, there is little doubt that the young people who were going to become the troops of the Wehrmacht were largely shaped by the spirit of Nazism and prepared for the type of war the regime was determined to wage. The Hitler Youth gained much of its charm by openly opposing traditional centers of authority, the family and the school, and presenting itself as a rebellious youth movement determined to destroy a formal and anachronistic present in order to create a brilliant future full of adventures and promises, but also as a highly devoted and disciplined body of followers, united by a single cause and led by an almost divine leader. This combination of rebellion against old forms and institutions, an exciting and fanatical devotion, a commitment to destroy the present and build the future, a desire to disobey old rules and leaders but still blindly follow the new ones, to act rather than think, this celebration of youthful vitality accompanied by a fascination with Nazism. The regime secured the loyalty of German children and youth, entrusting them with tremendous destructive powers. Some soon became old enough to wield them against the real or supposed external enemies of the Reich. The youngest generation was confined to the family circle and school, where they functioned as a body of agents and informants for the regime. Jochen Ziem and Karl Hildebrand, 12 and 16 years old respectively, spent an idyllic childhood in a village in Siegerland, and were on the verge of denouncing their parents to the Nazi authorities when they clashed with them over family matters and believed they were betraying the Reich. It was precisely the youngest soldiers of the Wehrmacht who most likely fell under the influence of Nazi indoctrination before being recruited. The young people who were between 6 and 11 years old in 1933 spent long years in the Hitler Youth and still had a good chance of finding themselves on the front during the war. It is interesting to note that the social origin of these young people seems to have played a minor role in the decision to take a stance regarding the regime and what we might expect from the patterns of support for the Nazi Party before it took power. Eugen Oker grew up in a Bavarian Catholic village and was 14 years old when Hitler rose to power, and in that same year he became a fervent follower of the Hitler Youth. Gustav Kopke, originally from the industrial region of the Ruhr, whose father and stepfather had been miners and communists before 1933, likewise became a devout member of the Hitler Youth. He was only 9 years old when he witnessed the Kristallnacht pogrom. It was tremendously impressive when the SA marched. I was on the side of the strong guys, the Jews were the others. For boys his age, Kopke recounted, being of working-class origin mattered very little. Strongly influenced by wartime propaganda, Kopke considered partisans to be Untermenschen and criticisms in his own country against the regime as treason, being on the verge of denouncing his parents for speaking with Zwangsarbeiter or Polish workers. In 1944, when he was barely 16 years old, Kopke volunteered for the SS HJ division, and like many of his contemporaries, he was left so distraught by the collapse of the 1,000-year Reich. Another son of a working-class family, Gisberg Pohl, was already a long-time member of the Hitler Youth when he volunteered for the Waffen-SS at the age of 18 in 1943. He underwent basic training at the Buchenwald concentration camp. Although there were exceptions, for example Heinrich Ball, who in his autobiography said that certain families maintained their children's loyalty and succeeded in preventing them from being captivated by the Hitler Youth. Even so, even in the case of Ball, we should remember that he served for 6 years in the Wehrmacht, most of the time on the Eastern Front, and although he was wounded on many occasions, he insisted on returning to fight. Furthermore, As some of his post-war stories reveal, he was not completely free from the stereotyped opinions about the enemy ingrained in every young and every German soldier. Nevertheless, there were many of these enthusiastic young people among the soldiers and young officers of the Wehrmacht, powerfully imbued with racist sentiments and the notion that war represented the climax of human existence. All others would remain wretched and repulsive beings, inferior individuals who shirk danger and who, when the die is cast, succumb to that danger. The youth organizations of the Third Reich were a tool of indoctrination with the aim of turning young people into malleable individuals, destined to serve the regime first as youth and then as adults. They were created in 1922 as part of the SA. According to records on the numbers of members of Nazi youth organizations from 1923 to 1939, the ascent curve is impressive. In 1923, 1,200 young people were members, and by 1932, 107,000. Racist ideas had begun to spread and take root in Europe much earlier. Already in the 17th century, thinkers and philosophers had speculated about the advent of human races. In 1854, the French diplomat Arthur de Gobineau published an influential book on the inequality of human races. According to Gobineau, the Aryan race was superior to all others, although it was threatened by the mixing of races with the non-Aryans, who were not on its level. In times when European nationalism and imperialism played a more important role, these thoughts were well received. Inspired by Charles Darwin's theories of natural selection, that is, that the best adapted individual is the one who survives, scientists and intellectuals of the Western world began to apply those biological ideas to human societies. The so-called social Darwinism contained ideas according to which the strong had the right to rule over the weak. A thinker of great influence was the Anglo-German H.S. Chamberlain, who presented in 1899 a vision according to which the Aryan race, led by Germans, would save European Christian civilization from enemy Judaism. In April of 1933, the Nazi Party attempted for the first time to devastate the Jewish economy. One way of proceeding was to let the young people of the Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend, put up warning posters on Jewish businesses. This type of action against Jewish doctors, lawyers, and businesses took place throughout Germany. In front of all Jewish shops, law firms, medical offices, and apartments, there were young people with posters bearing text such as, "Don't buy from the Jews," "Don't go to Jewish doctors," "Whoever buys from a Jew is a traitor," "The Jews are the embodiment of lies and fraud." One of the most atrocious events against the Jews was the Babi Yar massacre. This city, the oldest in Russia, was the scene of a massacre of Jews by a German squad with the help of the Ukrainian police. On the 29th of September, 1941, the day of the Great Pardon, and until the 3rd of October, about 100,000 people were shot dead. 1/3 of them were children. The bodies were piled into a ravine, and if some were found breathing, they were killed with grenades. Afterwards, the bodies were burned and the ashes scattered due to the proximity of the Red Army, which was approaching to liberate Kiev, an important and nearby city. Another event that generated resentment among the Allies was what happened in the village of Lidis, where on the night of the 9th of June, 1942, 300 men divided into 200 German SS soldiers belonging to the garrison of Slani and 100 Czech collaborators of the Czech police surrounded the village of Lidis and split into several detachments. There the final orders were given, stating, "Order of the Führer. Lidis will be razed to the ground and the male population executed by firing squad." The next morning the executions of the men had begun. In groups of 5 they were placed against a wall protected by mattresses so that the bullets would not ricochet as the troops opened fire. A total of 171 men were executed. However, according to the municipal census, there were 192 men, so 21 were missing. The truth was that 8 were in the prison of Kladno on suspicion, so they were transferred to Prague and executed. The other 13 were outside Lidis that day, due to work reasons, with 11 of them located and killed, while the last two, a miller and a metal worker, preferred to commit suicide rather than fall into German hands. The former hanged himself in his mill, and the latter cut his veins. Women and children were loaded onto trucks with their children and taken out of Lidis. At 11:30 in the morning, the entire village of Lidis was set on fire, building by building and house by house. Even the small church of St. Martin was burned. They also hid the bodies of the men by burying them in a mass grave, a task carried out by some Jewish slaves displaced to the area from the Theresienstadt concentration camp, who threw large portions of grass over the burials to obliterate the trace. When the village had been destroyed, the Germans celebrated by eating food they had taken from the village. Also, about 1,600 Jews from the town of Jedwaben, among men, women and children, were murdered in the cruelest manner. The victims were gathered in the square and then taken to a barn where they were burned alive. The elderly and children who could not move by their own means were dragged there and thrown into the flames. Since 1962 in Jedwaben, there is a plaque that said, "Place of martyrdom for the Jewish people." Hitler's Gestapo and gendarmerie burned alive 1,600 people. For many years, the Jedwabner massacre was attributed to an Einsatzgruppen of the SS. All this wave of young people trained in the Hitler Youth took root in one of the fiercest espionage systems of the time. Although little known, the history of espionage in the world is perhaps more evident than one might think. So much so that it goes back and was applied during historical periods, in diverse cultures, and even sometimes by the instinctive action of human beings in certain contexts. Therefore, it is necessary to explain how the art of spying began, but in the particular case of Nazi Germany in 1933. For that, it is necessary to take into account the scope and impact that were generated during and after the Nazi period, which offers an explanation of the operational mode and the interests on which information gathering was based, as well as the legacy generated from one of the most conflictive and hostile periods in the history of humanity. Since the period of the 3rd millennium BC, intelligence constituted one of the tools to reduce or dominate opponents and obtain complete information for decision-making in a problematic situation. The more information, the fewer the risks and scenarios for the enemy to be able to act against our will. The subject of military espionage in Germany was not new. It dated back to the time of Frederick the Great, more exactly in the 18th century, which suggests that from that moment espionage interests were being fostered. In the case of Germany, as mentioned earlier in other videos, the rise to power of the Nazis caused the end of the Weimar Republic, a parliamentary democracy established after the First World War, following the appointment of Adolf Hitler. And it was precisely as during Nazi Germany that its leaders began to promulgate the ideal of focusing on maintaining control over strategic areas and matters that constituted Hitler's hegemonic needs in Eastern Europe, a situation that split the interests of the leaders at that moment into two. On the one hand, there was the promotion of the Aryan race, which should populate and dominate the territory, and on the other, to dominate Eastern Europe with the same power, thus jointly consolidating the supremacy of territorial power and of race. This was due to Hitler's conviction and leadership, to which was added the innate faith that his followers and collaborators bestowed upon him, who shared not only his ideals but also the determination to decide about anything with a cool head, and without any kind of remorse about the fate of any being, according to their interests and needs. The figure of the German leader was surrounded by allies and faithful believers, minds that in turn possessed the decisive ability to filter any means and source of information for the benefit of the Reich and his pretensions. After understanding the objectives and nature of espionage, it becomes necessary to analyze the different profiles, positions, identities, functions and tasks that the German leaders of entities such as the secret police and the espionage agencies established by the regime had. Regarding the heads in charge of intelligence work, allies or not of the German system in this period, the calculating positions of Wilhelm Canaris, Reinhard Heydrich, Walter Schellenberg, and Reinhard Gehlen stood out. Wilhelm Canaris was an officer of the Kriegsmarine, head of the intelligence section of the Imperial Navy and its highest ministry as head of the military of the Wehrmacht. Since 1935, he was head of the military secret service known as the Abwehr. Later, he took part in conspiracies that were carried out to defeat Hitler. In 1943, he interviewed with the heads of some secret services, such as the American and British ones, as part of his mission to overthrow the regime. In addition to that, he continued with the support of the regime's opponents, which led to his dismissal and the order of execution, which the German leader himself ordered. On the other hand, Reinhard Heydrich, who served as head of the SS, was also known by other actors of the regime as a ruthless and cruel man in his way of acting. Heydrich came to serve as head of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, considered the main security office of the Reich, in charge of carrying out the Nazi mission, more precisely, the murder of Jews. From there came the recognition he acquired as a relentless person in his actions. Likewise, he performed functions of protector in the zones of Bohemia and Moravia for 1 year. In turn, Admiral Walter Schellenberg, who was part of the SS, achieved the leadership of this agency abroad. Despite his appearance and behavior, he was by nature suspicious, to the point that he even spied on his own agents. With such determination and mistrust, he came to demonstrate before General Himmler, the head of the security service in 1943, that Canaris, head of the army, had betrayed the Reich by attempting a stratagem to assassinate him, which led to his arrest and to the promotion of the admiral who took over Canaris's position. On the other hand, Reinhard Gehlen came to be considered the most effective agent, meriting mention thanks to his work in command of the pre-war artillery, as well as becoming the assistant of General Halder, who at that time held the position of head of the army. Thanks to his merits, he came to be in command of the foreign armies in the East, also known as the FHO, which had the mission of gathering information in the military area of Eastern Europe. Given his high degree of discipline, consistency, and demand, he came to consolidate an organized group of agents who, thanks to their careful skills in data collection, detailedly structured the ways of acting and the capacity of the Soviet forces. On the other hand, the Gestapo also had divisions in charge of espionage. Among them were Group 4D Weinmann, Section 4D3, Informants, Enemies of Foreigners and of the State, Schroeder, 2009. Similarly, Group 4E, Walter Schellenberg, Section of 1, General Defense Matters, Delivery of Reports about High Treason, Security of Factories and Customs Guard, Lindau. Section of 2, General Economic Matters, Defense and Economic Espionage. After Hitler came to power, the Gestapo, Geheime Staatspolizei, was established, created as a subsidiary and ally of the Abwehr. Soon, the first successful responses of the generated Brotherhood became known, since together they managed to dismantle the espionage operations that Polish agents carried out in the country, tasked with seducing women who worked as secretaries in the Ministry of War. As successes began to be reaped and in response to the strengthening of security and control capacity exercised by Germany in this new period, which sought supreme sovereignty, not only security, but an air of confidence was granted, which would tend to disappear when Hitler's period of governance came to an end. Cooperation between Germany and some of its allies offered him the possibility of situating and positioning himself, with their approval, in their territories. With this, German power not only increased but also benefited its allies, although mostly Germany, if one takes into account the hegemonic needs it had with respect to the interest of its allies, which were focused on overthrowing an internal ruler. Hence, two objectives emerge. The first, an expansive actor outside of its sovereign, territorial, and independent domains, and a second interest, which is internal and does not extend beyond its own territory. And it was precisely the German desire for expansion that, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, along with its agencies established on the 5 continents, would send diplomats and politicians, among others, in order to consolidate its presence and power in strategic spaces of the world. Taking into account the above, one infers the intense activity of German officials in a large part of the countries across the globe, who, faithful and believers in their power and mandate, settled in key areas that over time sought access to both industries and territories considered objectives in order to counteract their capacity to act and to coerce their actions in front of the enemies in order to impose dominion and supremacy. Germany was in a phase of empowerment, with the faithful conviction of building and consolidating self-sufficiency. Added to this is the supreme interest rooted in possessing control and the greatest possible decision-making power, dominion and capacity to act, in order to strengthen the expansive and radical ends. Goals set by Hitler that would ensure his maintenance and absolute power. After observing some of the events that took place, the concept of security for Germany resided in the idea of a secure territory, which must and had to count on the purity of its members, who, faithful to their condition, would act according to their own interests, primarily established by the power granted by the superior race, and this included children and young people who were trained in special training centers under the command of Baldur von Schirach, who, through his role as head of the Hitler Youth, played an important part in this ideological shaping of young people. This power was understood, among other things, as the power of superior intelligence that the Aryans possessed over other races. Likewise, the economic security established in the industrial and territorial domain gave authority and maintained control over vital and strategic resources, determinants for allies and for enemies. Finally, human security played another strategic role, since in the German case it was established under the same natural order that ensured mutual protection. Transition conflicts had a special place within the framework of the events that occurred around the mentioned period. The mission of the spy agents in the Nazi regime was based on the art of espionage in pursuit of the benefit of the Reich, and involved the natural risk of having the double meaning that some of them wanted and managed to apply in their work. Espionage, as a weapon of strategic superiority of the regime, played a fundamental role, because with it they sought to achieve a superior control that had rarely been seen before. This concludes after learning how the expiatory mission extended simultaneously across 5 continents, which demonstrates the intensity of the need for power, within limits that go beyond hegemony, given the marked ambition that little by little sought to adapt and position Nazi control in remote and unimaginable areas, some of which at the time would not have a major impact on the seizure of power, but which later would come to be decisive in the chess game that Hitler designed for Germany. As for those who developed and approved from the spheres of power, all these acts were subjected to post-war trial except for Hitler, who would commit suicide in his bunker. In this sense, the Allies had different positions on how this type of trial should be developed. For example, the British position received Soviet support. During the Tehran Conference of 1943, Stalin demanded the execution by firing squad of 50,000 German military personnel, politicians, and sympathizers. Again, to understand their position, one must remember that at that time the Soviet Union was bearing the weight of the war, as it had left millions dead in its path, besides having suffered the extermination of part of its population during the advance of the Nazi troops at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. However, progressively the Soviet Union was modifying its initial proposals, approaching those proposed by the British until it moved closer to the American postulates that persistently rejected immediate execution and supported the initiation of a proper trial process. 2 factors explain the change in the Soviet attitude. Firstly, its support for a formal trial was consistent with the practice carried out by the Soviet government during the 1930s repression, when prisoners were forced to go through a formal trial before being condemned, despite the fact that from a substantive point of view, the greatest legal aberrations could be committed. On the other hand, after the immense human and material losses during the war, Stalin saw in the German defeat an opportunity to organize a large-scale trial that could position the Soviet Union as a world superpower. And although it was paradoxical at that time, the North American authorities began to prepare to hold a proper trial despite British opposition. On the 26th of April 1945, Henry Stimson ordered that a group be organized to plan the prosecution of the main leaders of the Axis. On the 2nd of May, the official appointment of the prosecutor took place, a position that fell to Robert Jackson, a Supreme Court judge and former Attorney General of the state under Roosevelt, who was a specialist in trials against monopolies. Jackson would have full powers during negotiations with the other great powers, given the charisma that preceded him and his firm conviction that North American ideas would triumph on how to proceed with Nazi war criminals. Another especially difficult situation was the negotiations over the venue of the trial. Several cities were considered: Leipzig, Munich, Luxembourg. The Soviet Union favored Berlin, but this solution posed problems for the North Americans since it was in the Germany occupied by the Soviets. The city, on the other hand, was divided into 4 zones, which would give rise to more discussions. The head of the United States military government of occupation, General Lucius Clay, suggested Nuremberg. After a visit by Jackson and some British and French representatives, it was decided to hold the trial in that city. The Soviets initially raised some objections, but finally they adhered to the North American choice in exchange for Berlin to be the official seat of the court authorities. Although the Cold War was already beginning, the Allied authorities could not afford any public suspicion of discord for fear that the accused would take advantage of those differences for their own objectives. The choice was not casual, since, besides the symbolic value of holding the trial against the Third Reich in Nuremberg, the city where the great Nazi events took place, and in addition to being the place where the famous laws of 1934 were enacted, in which the first discriminations suffered by the Jews were established, its palace of justice had largely been saved from the Allied bombings. Another of the debates that surrounded the Nuremberg trial was the nature of the tribunal itself. While most thought it was effectively a tribunal of international law, other authors believed that it was actually nothing more than an occupation tribunal of the Allied powers, since Germany had not authorized the establishment of a supranational body. In any case, the legal basis for its legitimacy was the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich, and by virtue of the Berlin Declaration of the 5th of June 1945, the Allies assumed power in Germany.